Hello and welcome back to Google Firestarters. My name is Neil Perkin. I'm the host of Firestarters. And if you're new here, then Firestarters is the series of video conversations which we do with the great and the good, really, of the marketing and advertising industry. We like to say, actually, that this is about the interested and interesting, actually, of the industry. And that is a phrase, actually, which was inspired by today's guest, which is Russell Davies. Who is now the VP of Marketing at Bulb. And Russell has an enormous amount of experience, almost too much to talk about, really, but is a writer and a strategist, has worked for and with lots of different organizations, both client and agency side. So Honda, Nike, Microsoft, Apple, Weeden & Kennedy, us two. Was, of course, the director of digital strategy at the Government Digital Service, Co-op, and done many other side projects as well, including running things like the Interesting conferences, written for Wired, has a brilliant blog, done work which has appeared in MoMA and the Royal Academy even as well, and has also written a brilliant book, which is Everything I Know About Life I Learned from PowerPoint, which is fantastic. And I was just saying to Russell, actually, before we started, that I was writing notes, as I always do before these sessions, of things to ask, and I've just got reams and reams of notes, almost too many here, because there's so many insights in that book, which I think are brilliant. So welcome to Russell. Maybe if I can start there, actually, Russell, and just ask you by way of introduction why you chose to write a book about PowerPoint.
There's no good answer to that. Well, ages ago, I wrote a book about cafes and fried food. And I realized a few years ago that PowerPoint is the second love of my life. And that there was what really got me going is I wrote a thing for Wired a little while ago. I think it was the 30th anniversary or the 29th anniversary or something of the invention of PowerPoint, and that led to like journalists who wanted to write articles about PowerPoint getting in touch with me, and they always wanted to write the same article, which is like death by PowerPoint. Why do people do PowerPoint? It blah, blah, blah. And it just made me cross. I just thought PowerPoint is better than that. And the mainstream narrative about it is wrong. And the more I looked into it and the more I thought about it, when I discovered Robert Gaskins, who was the inventor of it, I just thought, this is a really good story. And also a good excuse for me to like peddle my terrible opinions, basically.
And you're right, it is a good story, and there's so much in there. So I recommend it to everyone and anyone, really. But as you know, Firestarters is structured around 5 key questions. So really around learning and also mistakes you've made and insights, predictions, and so on. So I'd love to get stuck into the first question, if I may, and just ask you about, across all of those different, working client, agency side, public sector, private sector, what is your key learning from your career to date, and what would you pick out as being a big learning for you?
The simple answer is how to make things simpler. The more complex and nuanced answer is how to dance between simplicity and complexity. I think I remember a phase, probably when I was working at Weeden & Kennedy, where I got obsessed with Saatchi's, was it M&C Saatchi? One of the Saatchis, some Saatchi's old sort of strategic thing of brutal simplicity. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so reductive and blah, blah, blah. How can they say that? It's ridiculous. Like effective communications is nuanced and complex and blah, blah, blah. And then just as I've done more, as I've worked in more places, I've realized how smart that is, not necessarily for making communications, but for getting organizations to do things. And I think planning is, or strategy, very often positions itself as about like clever thinking. I think the most successful strategists are just people who can manage to get an organization to do something. And that demands brutal simplicity, brutal and subtle simplicity, I guess, is the thing I'd add to it. But you also have to recognize that not everything can be simple, and that if you're actually making a piece of work, or you're actually writing something, or that in the weeds, in the detail, you need nuance and complexity and all those kinds of things. So just making things shorter isn't enough. It turns out that making things shorter is really, really hard, and people really struggle to do it. But it's, if you can do that and then do the other stuff, I think that's the big lesson.
Yeah, there's a really interesting part in the book where you talk about in the context of presentations, obviously use words, not too many, mostly short. Do you think planners have this kind of tendency to kind of show how much they know and show how clever they are?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, well, I do. And I also think, as I've worked with, I mean, the average age of people I work with now is probably like 23, 24. Like, a lot of them are recent graduates. And I realized, for instance, that their education trains them to write badly and teaches them that they're writing well. And so you have to sort of, it's like the army, you have to like break them down and then reconstruct them, because they're a university academic way of writing is bloodless and deliberately distanced and academic, I guess. And that's not an effective way of writing in many circumstances. And I think planning is just that, like times 10, or a lot of strategy is that times 10. People are, what's it like? I guess it's like showboating in football. You know what I mean? That there's a kind of there's the effective crossfield pass. That's what you're looking for, or there's the step over. You know, and planning does too many step overs and not enough. You know, like long diagonal pass that releases a forward. That analogy is falling apart, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think there's a interesting story which you tell in the book actually about how you were asked into a packaged goods company to do like a presentation about digital innovation, I think it was. And then 2 years later you were asked back again and nothing had changed. And then 2 years later after that you're asked back again. And so you realize really that you were just kind of the interesting sort of person brought in to kind of be interesting, but actually nothing was really happening as a result of that. So that point about how planners can get organizations to do something different, you know, what's the really key thing there? What's the important thing of how they can do that?
I think realizing, particularly what worked for me, is recognizing that we're very seldom considering doing something horribly stupid. Like it's very rare that you're choosing between 5 strategies, 3 of which will completely destroy the company, or that, you know, that will result in some terrible tragedy. You're normally choosing between a bunch of strategies which are mostly fine, because, you know, it's like reasonably smart people not trying to do like like good. Wish we had that much power that we could do something that might cause a disaster. So once you recognize that, you're kind of going, okay, we're mostly optimizing between reasonably good options. What we should be looking for is which one is likely to happen, because that's the big organizational barrier a lot of the time. Is it's not, are we doing the right thing, but are we going to do anything? At least, and certainly, are we going to do anything different or new, or you know, that we've not done before? Getting a lot of organizations to do that is about going, okay, out of these strategies, this one I can explain quickly. It's got like a little emotional hook. I can express it in 3 words. It's like that gives that idea an edge, even if it's 5% less good than the other ideas. And it's recognizing that you need to optimize for the ability to do something, not just being right. And we try too hard, I think, sometimes to be right without recognizing that we also need to actually make something happen.
Yeah, and I think probably as you were talking there, it struck me as well, some of the things you talked about that you did at the government digital service about, getting them to think differently, perhaps, about how you did things. So, framing things in really simple ways. Like I think there was that, forgive me if I get this wrong, but the kind of way of just thinking about good user experience in terms of simpler, faster, quicker, just like phrases like that that just enable people to just understand and get what you're trying to do. Do you think there's kind of how you communicate this, the way in which you present it, the kind of ways of capturing this kind of ideas are really important to communicate like that in organizations?
Yes, I mean that's a good example. The work of GDS, like the actual work of GDS, was enormously complex and difficult and challenging, and was done by people other than me. And all we did, or my little team did, was create or try and create some of the conditions in which that work was possible. And that was mostly by giving people a quick shorthand way of understanding what we were doing. And that's particularly where I learned the value of giving language to journalists, to people outside the company, to other people, who to frame what you were doing. So we just 3 words we put on the website when we launched it. They're still there, and that's still how people describe government services, because people are busy. They don't, I mean, not all government services, had to be said, but people are busy. They don't want to think about it loads. Journalists are busy. They don't want to think about it loads. They just kind of go, and they used to write the new government website, which is blah blah blah, because it was right there and easy to use. You can't do that if it's obviously not true. People will pull that apart. But if it's a convenient and sensible way of describing what you're doing, going to the trouble of framing it for them, I think is helpful.
Yeah, and one of the other things that actually I was thinking about there is the famous sort of Bezos thing about how he banned PowerPoint, and a number of other kind of leaders of organizations have done the same thing because they think it's not a particularly good way of expressing a story and favors the presenter rather than who's being presented to. And so that hence the sort of the shift towards narrative and memos and things like that. And you raise an interesting point there about actually probably the reason behind that is because people like Bezos maybe just want to actually consume that information at their own pace. And so there's probably a lesson for just, it's not the tool that's at fault, it's probably how you're presenting it. So do you think actually that that's true in a broader sense, really? So sometimes you need to explain things in certain ways, but actually you can simplify it often. And it's just the way in which you're using the tools like PowerPoint to do that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously you can use PowerPoint to do a bad presentation. And obviously presentations are sometimes the wrong tool. That and a well-written memo is obviously as a useful thing. And in fact, Robert Gaskins, who invented PowerPoint, was a master of a well-written memo. He understood the value of that. And a lot of the sort of popular narrative around PowerPoint is blaming it for being a thing which it isn't. So that's one thing. I think the thing around people like Bezos, the story that pops up every now and then, which is someone else has banned PowerPoint, is a lot of that. I mean, some of that is to do with like just bad presentation culture inside a company. A lot of it is to do with power. I think it's to do with the fact that someone like Bezos wanted to consume information that was suitable for him, or suitable for his executives, or suitable for the kind of person who's at the top at Amazon, and that doesn't optimize often for the needs of the person who is the presenter. And I mean, it's coincidence, but PowerPoint's got the word power in it, and it's a lot of the time it's about power. And one of the things PowerPoint does is it gives people a stage. And they're often people who don't have a stage. They're often people who need help being in the spotlight or need support talking to their boss. And PowerPoint does that a lot of the time. And when people ban it, to me, that's a sign of a corporate culture that doesn't value everyone's voice in the same way, I guess. And they're banning it because they're impatient, because they're frustrated by their, subordinates' inability to get to the point. And that's not all an organization should be. It should be more polite than that. And it should be more tolerant of someone hesitating because they might say something really important in 30 seconds. And a good presentation culture allows that to happen.
Fantastically put. So I'd love to move on to my second question, if I may. So this one's about mistakes. So the biggest mistake that you've made in your career and what you learned from that.
I'm part of the same thing, like being mean, I think, is probably the biggest mistake I've made. I've been an asshole. And a lot of that has come from that culture of argument and debate, and we're here to be right, and we're here to be cleverer than the other person, and that the way you do that is with words and sharpness and all that kind of thing. And I think there have been occasions where I've put people down, I've been sarcastic, I've been mean to them, and that matters. That's between people. I mean, I've obviously made enormous strategic mistakes as well, but they, like I say, they don't really matter. So yeah, I wish I'd been nicer.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite surprising because you're one of the nicest chaps I've met, I think. So interesting you talk about that. But I think, I can recognize also that there are times when you might sort of be in a situation and act in a certain way and then later regret it. But I mean, what causes that? Why do you do that? What happens? Not you personally, but in general, why do people sometimes do that within companies, organizations, maybe when they're under pressure? I don't know, but what causes it?
Well, privilege to start with. We are, it's easier. I've been in a lot of organizations where it's easy for me to be bossy, to be, I've got the voice in the room. And if you use it insensitively, it's disproportionately hurtful. And I mean, also, a lot of agency environments, particularly, are tense and stressful and late, and I think often agency client relationships or agency cultures exaggerate that and make that a virtue, and that's part of the romance and the drama, and you get swept up in that, the kind of, it's like you think you're in an Aaron Sorkin production, you think you're doing witty intellectual debate, but sometimes you're just being an arse, and but the seduction of that, the look how clever I'm being, is kind of quite powerful, I think.
Yeah. And there was an interesting example I think you gave in the book about how you were doing some training, I think presentation training at one point, and one of the people in the training, or a colleague, I can't remember, but she said to you, well, not everyone can do that, because not everyone has your privilege or position, or is coming from the place that you do. So do you think we miss kind of context like that a lot?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did. I mean, it took someone to literally say it to me. Ella Fitzsimmons, that was, by the way, who yeah, I mean, did me an enormous favor, because I'd been in a lot of presentation training because it's sort of an interest of mine, at the receiving end. and never noticed a lot of the stuff that they were doing. And when I started doing it to other people, I mean, I have a particular way of doing presentations, which a lot of the time is quite low key, quite, it's not, I don't project in a sort of big way. And, I don't spend a lot of time like establishing my credentials and stuff that people say you should do. And I was blithely passing this advice on to people. And Ella said, "That's all right for you. You're like a tall white man." Not everyone has that, and therefore not everyone's granted that authority when they stand on a stage. You should think about that when you're doing training. And she was right. And I think particularly for a profession that prides itself on its insight and all those kinds of things, it's good to think about that.
Yes, that's well put. And speaking of insight, let me move on to the third question, which is actually about your insight into how marketing and advertising, how the industry is changing. There's a lot, obviously, that we could talk about here, but what have you picked out as being your key thought here?
I mean, it doesn't change, does it? That's the big thing. There's a book here somewhere, like from the 30s. I've got quite a collection of old advertising books.
Yeah,
they're all exactly the same as anything now. Or if you look at Paul Feldwick's book, the
Anatomy of Humbug.
Anatomy of Humbug. Like, I get pitches all the time from digital agencies and like new innovative blah blah blah, and that it's all based on like awareness. It's all based on exactly the same stuff that someone made up in the 30s. So there's no fundamental change. There's just a bit of different wrapping. And I think a lot of that's because I always think advertising and marketing is like alchemy, rather than like science. Like, we're trying to do something and we're using sort of scientific methods, but because no one ever shares the actual story about what actually happened, no learning is possible. There's no institutional learning, there's no one ever tells the real stories of how something happened, because it's not in our interest to do that. If we have a accidental success, it's the story's rewritten to be about how clever we were.
Right.
And there's no obligation to publish your to reveal the real truth. So everyone goes, "Oh, right, the way they did that was by having an insight. Well, I'd better have an insight." Whereas the reality is the way they did that is the creatives had an idea in the top drawer and it fitted the brief, but no one. So when I first went to the States, so I went to Wieden and Kennedy in Portland in the mid-90s. And I was kind of the second tranche of British planner to go to the US. There'd been a bunch of people before. John Steele, was M.T. Rainey one of them? There was a bunch of people, like John Steele went to Goodby, Chris Riley went to Wieden. There was a bunch of people who went there. And the narrative, I mean, overnight, like, the advertising got better. Like, a particular bit of the advertising got better, and particular agencies started doing very creative work, kind of strategically challenging, blah blah blah. And everyone was like, it's the planning revolution, the British have done this, and that's largely why I got our job. But I remember when I got there, I looked at a bunch of that work that had done well. And I realized that I think, I'm just in my theory, I think what had happened is that a bunch of people who turned up who had good experience about how to get work through pre-testing. They, because there was a load of campaigns around that time, really good, interesting work that had small dogs in it. And there was a Taco Bell campaign, there was a Nissan campaign, there was a bunch of stuff that for no good reason had a little dog in it at the end. And that was just a bunch of people who'd grown up in a particular world, who knew if you wanted to get some brave work through pre-testing, put a small dog in it. had arrived. It's like they'd arrived in a new country where they didn't have the wheel yet. And they kind of they transformed the scene for about a year until the pre-testing companies and the clients got wind of it. But I presume that's not in anyone's case study about that work. So there's a kind of, we never tell the truth about what we do, and so there's no learning, and therefore there's no change.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's some that say, like, classic sort of advertising theory, the kind of thing that Paul Feldwood talks about in his book, is not well enough known in the industry, and everybody's sort of focused on the latest shiny thing. What's your view on that?
That's, I don't know. I mean, I think partly what Paul talks about, I say Paul, Mr. Feldwick talks about, is there's a kind of folk understanding of how advertising works, which no one ever challenges. There's just these. I used to. I mean, again, part of annoying me. I very often, with a new project, at the beginning of a meeting or the beginning of a project, I get everyone in the room and say, before we start, how do we think advertising works? And get everyone to talk about it. And you'd start with people going, and would trot out theories, and they'd be broadly the same sort of folk theory about, a USP, like vaguely heard things, USP, awareness, blah, blah, blah. And I, it would be like, well, no wonder this process is going to go wrong because no one agrees on what we're doing. And the nuances of what we're doing and why we're doing it and things like that. So there's that. And then, every 5 years, there's a new layer of something fashionable and new on top of that kind of unsubstantial foundation. It's like no one ever fixes the foundation. We just go and get a new bit of wallpaper. That's falling apart as well. But you know what I mean? It's yeah. And again, because it seldom goes horribly wrong. You don't fix it. It just kind of, oh, well, that didn't work. Something else will, and sometimes it works, right? Like those folk understandings are broadly accurate, probably, or good enough for you to make some work, which might accidentally succeed. And then you put a new layer on top of it of something clever and fun, and people like stuff that's clever and fun, so it kind of works again. That's very bleak, isn't it? But I think there is a it never becomes science, and it never becomes art. You know what I mean? It's just always in that uncomfortable kind of territory in the middle where you have these kinds of conversations all the time, because it's just always in between these things. And what happens in the real world is practitioners and craft and people muddling through, and that often produces stuff that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to ask actually about something you mentioned in the Firestarters talk, which you get. Oh God, this must be, think about 7 years ago. I think it probably was a long time ago. But so sorry to drag this up, but it was a really interesting point you made about product and marketing, and you were talking about how sort of it's easier to do brilliant product these days than it is to just have a parity product and then do marketing on top of that and differentiate through marketing. I mean, is that still the way you feel now?
That is interesting. I've forgotten about all that. Yeah, I mean, it was so I guess that was a phase in the development of lots of categories where software innovation was perhaps the best way to innovate in a market. And if you were good at that, you could get a substantial advantage quite quickly versus spending a lot of money on marketing. I suspect that effect is lessened now. I still think. Let me come at this a slightly different way. So that, 15 years of or however long it is of behavioral science and people in marketing reading behavioral science books, I think to me boils down to, if you want to get people to do something, make it easy. And I think that's right. I think number one thing to do if you want to get people to do something is make it easy. The problem organizations face is making things easy to do is really hard. And a lot of if it had been easy to make it easy, it's already been done. So what's happening now is people trying to find ways to make hard things easy. And like I say, that's hard. So you have to organizationally commit a lot of resources and people and effort and time to go to fixing this one little thing to make it easier. And there's a temptation sometimes to just do some marketing to suggest that it's easy, rather than actually fixing the problem. And that feels like the phase we're in now, where like all the delivery companies, right? It's gone from impossible to get something delivered in a day to relatively easy to get something delivered in a day. But now that the pace of innovation has slowed on, can they actually get it to your door on a reliable basis, or tell you that they've delivered it, or that service innovation has slowed. They did a tremendous thing very quickly and then has slowed. And I presume all the delivery companies are now having lots of meetings about how do we make our brand, stronger, blah, 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 when they could be going, how do we improve our notifications? But actually improving the notifications is really difficult.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's where you put your corporate effort. I think is the big, and for a time it made sense to put your corporate effort into software product improvement rather than marketing. I still think that's fundamentally the thing to do, but it's harder to get the returns on that probably at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there was a nice way you had a framing this, I think, which is a quote that I've written down here, which is about, if you made something brilliant and it doesn't explain itself, you've not made something brilliant, which is a lovely way of putting it. But I guess I'm curious here about to ask a bit of a follow-up here, because one of the things that's gone on in organizations really is this whole kind of focus on customer experience, part of which is marketing, part of which is product, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there as well. So that's created arguably quite lots of blurred lines between marketing as a function and lots of other things as well. So do you think that's done marketing a favor, or do you think it's a challenge, or is it an opportunity? What's your thought on that?
GDS, we always used to say the product is the service is the marketing. People don't differentiate between those things. Why should we? Organizationally, that's really hard because unless all those things are done by the same person, there's always rivalries and silos and organizations and politics, and that's really difficult. And you end up with what you tend to end up with is one of those silos dominating, I think, and that you become a marketing-led organization or a service-led organization or something else. And I think doing marketing inside a service-led organization is perhaps my happiest place, because I know that we're optimizing for the thing that really matters, and I'm trying to help. Having worked in my job at Nike, when I went to work there was because there was a realization that marketing and product were both doing brilliant things, but in parallel. Right. They were connected, and every 2 years at a World Cup or European Championships, they'd kind of go, oh, we've done all the marketing about this and you've made the product about that. So there was an attempt to go, well, let's start from a common brief. Let's start from the same place, and then we'll go. But that kind of thing is really hard to coordinate groups of people in that way. It is really hard, and I think probably you have to end up with some sort of hierarchy. You have to end up with, we are led by service, or we are led by product, or we are led by marketing, and everyone fits in behind that. And then that will change your relationship with your category and with your customer. And there, any of those ways is a way to succeed. What gets difficult is if you try and, it's much harder to improve the service if you're a marketing-led organization, and
Right.
that kind of thing. And sometimes the category just goes, yeah, you're the wrong type of organization now. That and that's when things fall apart.
Brilliant. And let me just move on to my next question, which is about predictions, actually. So I'm going to ask you to think about the future here a bit. And you're welcome to sort of take this as planning or marketing or advertising, whichever way you want. But what would be a prediction that you'd like to pick out here for the future?
You know how big bands, like touring rock bands, they existed for a brief window of time. You know what I mean? That like big popular music making money from albums and gigs existed from like 1969 to 1999 or whatever. And before that, there was just folk music and people making their own music and stuff like that. And probably after that, there's going to be, like, it's going to be really hard to make a brilliant living from music. A few people will make a reasonable living from music, but like that kind of era is over. And it feels like big ads is a bit like that. That there was a sort of advertising bubble in London and New York and some other places where there was a confluence of money and talent and ideas and things like that, which fed itself for a while in a really kind of interesting way, and where society had a relationship with advertising which made sense. It's like the advertising paid for some television channels and some newspapers, and it was weird that it did that. Like it was strange that you got, all those daily newspapers for not much money in exchange for advertising. Like you wouldn't have designed that as a process. That fell apart because the tech giants arrived, built the biggest businesses on earth and tore society apart with advertising. And I'm not sure we'll ever put it back together. I'm not sure anyone will go, yeah, let's have another go at that. Let's try and do it some other way. It feels like those worlds of advertising, like the first world of good ads in the middle of Corrie, aren't coming back, and that second world of data surveillance and things, I think is going in some way or other. It's just not sustainable. And then it's kind of what comes next. I've always felt is a bit like the natural size of advertising is about the same as the natural size of graphic design. Like in most of the world, every town has got a person who does some advertising for the garage and for the chip shop or whatever. But there's not like a huge industry. And graphic design's like that. Like most graphic design businesses are one person. And some of it is brilliant. And very, very occasionally, one of them will get featured in a program on BBC Two. And that feels like the natural size of advertising, at least for me. And marketing inside businesses, I think, again, adjusts accordingly. Like having run an internal creative team inside a marketing business, inside a business, you realize how so much of it is so much easier if you do it yourselves. There are things that are still impossible to do that you need real specialists for, But increasingly, you don't need 500 people in Soho. You need like 2 people and a production company for a week. And yeah, so it feels like that era is perhaps fate. I mean, has gone, and we're just hearing the echoes a little bit now. I mean, and I feel enormously lucky to have seen a bit of it, you know. But it feels like it's going.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you're saying there, but I guess I'm kind of interested to know in that lots of talk about how advertising can be or should be part of culture, and it feels like what you're saying there is like big campaigns maybe are not part of culture in the way that they once were, and it's sort of all evolved. Is that the case, do you think?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that's true, and I think it's chicken and egg a bit. It's I mean, partly, like, again, people our age, very old people, Neil. The we fondly remember advertising campaigns of our youth because we saw them thousands of times, you know, and there was nothing else to see, you know. So, and I think probably creatively they were better, but they just saw them a lot, and that doesn't happen anymore. That's just really hard to do now. That kind of just weight of things is hard to do now. I also think the advertising world we grew up in was unusually effective culturally because we didn't have a film industry in the UK. So people who wanted to make films went into advertising for a bit, and then went off to Hollywood, like your Alan Parkers and all those kinds of people. So that the industry got a grander sense of what it could do because it was full of this talent that couldn't get work anywhere else. And also because it was probably more diverse talent than a lot of the other creative industries. So if you couldn't get into BBC Two because you were working class, you ended up in advertising. If you were creative and interesting, but needed to make some money, you ended up in advertising, because your parents didn't know anyone in publishing or museums or broadcasting or whatever. So there was a period where the advertising industry was disproportionately interesting because it had economic power and it had basically all the talented working class kids in it. Those 2 things have gone as well, and so the chicken. So like clients don't see, like, when was the last famous advertising campaign? No one goes, I want one of those, because there aren't any of them to point at. And I mean, increasingly, like, again, I talk to my younger colleagues about work I've done. They've never heard of it, never heard of COG, never heard of Run London, which is depressing because I was hoping to surf off those things into a quiet retirement, but it turns out I have to do more work, Yeah, those things fade enormously quickly.
So just in terms of where it's going, just to ask a follow-up question to this. So yeah, in terms of how marketing is perhaps evolving, then what's the kind of the upside, the positivity of that? Where are we heading now, which actually means that marketing has a great opportunity and a really sort of it might be changing, but actually it's all an opportunity for the function and for the discipline and for the things that we do.
I honestly, I think one thing will be, there was a tremendous column or article in a newspaper a while ago by is it John Timpson? It can't be John Tim, the guy from Timpson's.
Oh yeah.
It can't be John Timpson because that's someone else. Maybe it is. Anyway, he wrote this thing about how when they acquire a new business, so they bought someone like Snappy Snaps recently or someone like that, they rip out all the electronic point of sale, and they stop collecting tons of data, and they ask their managers just to report how much cash they've taken in every day. Basically, they have like one piece of data which everyone knows, which is sort of intuitive, and that's how they manage the business. And I was in a meeting a little while ago, with an external sort of partner pitching their business, and they started their pitch with, "I bet you're wondering how to collect more data about your customers." And I was sitting there thinking, I'm actually wondering about how to collect much less data about my customers. And I think the data gold rush era is declining. Like, we've never had more data about our customers, and and we understand them less and less. And I think it won't be long before there are businesses boasting that they are data free, and just doing stuff because it feels right, because they know people, because they've talked to their actual customers, they're having a hunch, they're doing something well, and that will turn into another annoying fad. But I think that we've all gathered so much data, and it's not helped. And I think that will start to be a thing where people with some intuition or some empathy or something, a spark or something, will get, again, like, disproportionate results and start to be rewarded for that, and that will become a thing.
I guess that brings us kind of full circle, really, doesn't it, to your first point, which is about simplicity, which is quite a nice sort of circular kind of thing to that. It just leaves me with my last question here, which because we're running short on time, sadly, but I'd love to ask you, what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that?
That's the unfair one, Neil, because that's basically going, what do you want to show off about? My wife said I should say that the question is, have you written a book? And I mean, it's funny, I collect good questions, because I'm so socially awkward. I do, all the every now and then there's a listicle or a TikTok about, like, if you're stuck in an awkward situation, ask these questions.
Yeah.
The best one I've come across is and I think it's a great strategic question, a great interview question, and a great, like, pub question. Not that I ever go to pubs, but you say that. Which is, what are you really good at that is also really hard? And I think that's a great question to ask a business, and also your mates. And that probably would take us back to the beginning again. I think that is. I think I've slightly weaponized an annoying habit, which is to kind of summarize things. Yeah. I find it very difficult to read corporate language and not try and remove words. And that's a habit. And it turns out that I can enjoy a reasonable living by doing that for large corporations.
Fantastic. Well, great answer to that question. And that brings us to the end of our time. So Russell Davies, thank you so much for being part of Firestarters. Really great to have you on. And for everyone that's watching, don't forget to share the video and like it and so on. But my thanks to Russell Davies. Thanks for taking the time, Russell.
Thanks, Neil. This is the best thing that anyone does. I love this.
Very kind of you to say. Thank you very much.